And that's what's happened. And you know, if you're a shareholder at Oracle, I'm sure you're very happy with the way that's all worked out. But the kind of the philosophy of sharing and not being evil, sort of, that's, I don't remember that. Anyway, so subsequently after Oracle acquired Sun, and the corporate culture that changed, of course, the Republic turned into the Empire. What also occurred was the external sharing of Solaris was stopped. Now, prior to this occurring, there had already been people that were starting to do commercial ventures on Solaris technology, OpenSolaris technology. Nexenta was doing it. I think Garrett was doing it. There are quite a few people actually doing some things, but it was a very dangerous time because Solaris itself was not open. Critically, there were parts of libc. There still are some platform drivers, but you can now build at least an open platform. But critically, parts of a substantial portion of libc was closed, which made it impossible to actually have an open Solaris. Open Solaris wasn't. And as I had started at that time, I had just left Oracle to work at another company that was building some interesting technology on Solaris, Nexenta. And it occurred to me that the community needed to be free from those ties, those closed source ties. At the same time, the community needed to have some safeguard, because although I really didn't recognize Palpatine Ellison as the Grand Emperor of the Dark Force, I did recognize that there was a risk of too much control being centralized there, and in particular, that commercial interests, it did make sense for the commercial interests to abdicate to the community interests that had no basis on commercial value. That never made sense. And so one of the goals of the Illumos project was to allow OpenSolaris to kind of grow beyond Oracle. And it was actually intended not to be the relationship was not intended to be one of hostility, but one of cooperation. Actually, I reached out my hand at the time to Oracle, and I invited them to be a party to the Illumos process. And what I suggested to them was, here's a way for Oracle to have their cake and eat it too. They can be a party to this and an active participant and a contributor, while still retaining absolute dictatorial control that they and their shareholders would have demanded over what really was a flagship product, Solaris. You know, this idea that you could have community members deciding the future of Solaris, that just made no sense whatsoever, and that was never going to work. So the idea, you know, when I announced this way, the trade magazines called it a spork. Illumos is a spork, not a fork. And I thought that was very funny at the time too. Unfortunately, about 2 weeks later, came not the fork but the cork, which was shoved right up the tap, and the source code dried up. So we stopped getting code releases in the community from Oracle. And there has not been code releases of the Solaris kernel code coming from Oracle ever since that occurred back in 2010, I think. I think it was 10. Oh my goodness, we're actually we're closing in on 4 years here. I think April is the 4-year anniversary month, if I recall correctly. That just occurred to me. Wow. Time flies.
I should have brought birthday cake.
Time flies. Somebody can check me on that, because that is just from memory, and I could be wrong, but I think that's right, actually. So now we've gotten through episodes 1 through 3. And you know, Solaris, as Anakin Skywalker, has turned to the dark side, been turned by the Chancellor, serving the forces of evil. actually just to serve the forces of commercialism, but it's a very selfish commercialism. And from a certain point of view, those interests were not terrible. From a certain point of view, Palpatine's empire had some core values in it that were actually not terrible. Peace and prosperity. It's all the rest of the things that go with it that make that less desirable. And certainly, for many people, that it's not an open culture, neither in the empire nor in the Oracle ecosystem. So, Illumos arrives, and rather unfortunately, it didn't happen a long, long time ago. Only about 4 years ago, and not very far away, actually, right here in California. Illumos was born. Actually, technically it was announced in New York, but it was really born here. I'd been working on it for a few months before it was announced. Okay, so a little bit about diversity. So even back then, the theory that I had about, and by the way, before we close on the other things, you can start to draw analogies to various other characters in the Star Wars universe with people you know in the Illumos ecosystem. And I will leave that as an exercise for the listener. Now that'll keep you guys occupied for a good 10 or 15 seconds at least. Okay, so about diversity. So one of the things that Illumos created when I announced it, I announced it with critically a piece of code, which was the opening of libc. We broke the change to the closed source, so it could truly be open. What it gave was the power, as Brian Cantrell said, the power to fork. So now people could go off and do other things. And actually, my first reaction to this was, as people were talking about forking, it's like, oh my gosh, the community's going to fragment. This is a terrible thing. Terrible, terrible. No, it's not. In fact, it's been the best thing possible for our community. And you can look at this in other communities as well. A community that's probably familiar to most of the people in the room is the Linux community. There are, I don't know how, I lost track of so many distributions, and most of the distributions I used to use are gone. You know, who here remembers the MCC interim release? Okay, just me. It was really cool. There probably are some of you that remember SLS. And all the floppies that came on, and then Slackware for the really lazy people. Actually, Slackware's still around, but I think.
Yeah.
SLS was what inspired Slackware. So, anyway. Yggdrasil. Who remembers Yggdrasil? But the thing is that rather than having just one of these things, by having a diversity, and this is whether this is distributions or operating systems, or many other things, it's good. And forking is a positive thing. It allows a certain amount of Darwinism, but it also allows, as with Darwin, it allows evolutionary paths to be pursued that allow a niche things to thrive in niche ecosystems. So IPS isn't for everybody. Conversely, ZFS isn't for everybody. So anyway, that's critical here, and in particular, you'll see as I talk a little bit more about this. It's also good to have this in the operating system space, operating system kernel space as well. So Illumos becomes one more of the open open Unix-ish, or Unix. I won't say Unix derived because Linux isn't really Unix derived, but Unix-like operating systems. And having another kernel, and it's one that shares very little heritage with the other two main kind of branches, Linux and BSD. And having that variety allows a good, healthy cross-pollination. But the other piece here is it's not just competition. Critically, cooperation. And there's a lot of cooperation that occurs Some of it openly, some of it less openly, some of it actually in ways that are probably legally problematic. But there's a lot of sharing of code and concepts and experiences. I cannot say how many times I've hit a random problem with a piece of hardware, and I've gone to look at the source code for a few different operating systems to see if any of them have figured out how to work around this current errata du jour. And I'm quite confident that some of those guys have done the same for mine. There's code that goes from Illumos that gets fed back to BSD. Actually, there's code from Illumos running on my Mac that I didn't put there, that Apple put there. There's probably actually some on the phone, although I haven't really looked, because of the code sharing between iOS and macOS. There's code that goes back to Linux. So now we've got bits and pieces of people running ZFS on Linux, for example. There's bits and pieces of drivers, and this happens out in the open. It also happens, by the way, under the covers. Where it happens under the covers, example, company Intel. Who uses an Intel NIC? Yeah? Most of us do. So Intel has one common code base for their NIC drivers, and there's a lot of sharing that goes on inside Intel back and forth. So while that doesn't happen out publicly in the community, that common code base is something that the whole community benefits from. It's an internal cooperation, in addition to the external cooperation. So speaking of cooperation and competition, we can talk about distributions. There have been others. These are Illumos distributions, and I don't believe that this list is comprehensive. Some of these will be familiar to you guys, some of them won't. You can Google around. They have different ideas. Not all of them you can download. NetVisor, you cannot. The way you get NetVisor is you buy one of my company's switches, Pluribus. I say it's my company, it's my employer's switches, my employer. I don't own the company. I'd like to, but I don't. Same thing, the Xenta Store you can buy as a product. You may be running SmartOS in a data center. And SmartOS has actually made all kinds of interesting changes to challenge the way we think about running systems. Those of you who have not actually had the opportunity to discover SmartOS, I strongly encourage you to, particularly if you run systems in a data center that have to host compute. It will change the way you think about things. Not everyone gets it, but those who do generally find it very enlightening and productivity enhancing. Delphix, you get that with, and I don't know if that's actually what they call it internally, but they run it on their appliances. They sell a database acceleration appliance that runs Illumos. The other three down at the bottom are downloadable. And there's others you can download. There was an Xenta Core platform, you could have downloaded that. Open Indiana Speaker. I didn't put, is OmniOS on there? It is. Okay, good. So anyway, there's a bunch of them. And the beauty here is that these different distributions have the ability to service different niches. If I want something truly open that is kind of more or less the quasi-reference, I probably want to run Open Indiana. If I want commercial support for a general purpose operating system, I probably want OmniOS. If I want a hypervisor, I'm probably going to find myself with SmartOS. If I'm going to buy a network switch, or I'm working on an operating system for a network switch, I might find that NetVisor is something that I might be interfacing with, etc.
And if you wanted a supported storage appliance,
yeah, you might find yourself interfacing with an Xenta Store. Actually, Illumos is probably used in many other things, both in the context of an Xenta Store and not in the context of an Xenta Store, in both scenarios, by a number of storage vendors. My belief is that the capabilities that are in ZFS, and to a significant but not quite as large amount in the multi-tenancy capabilities that are there, in zones and in dtrace, have led to a fairly substantial adoption of Illumos in storage products. And there's a lot of companies running Illumos on hardware that you don't know about. And they don't talk about it. And I really wish they would, but that's probably another conversation. Actually, that led right into Spaces. So here we are. You know, and I apologize. I really didn't plan this talk at all. So I'm just kind of random. And if anybody's got questions, yell out, speak up. So you know, Spaces, you can find it. We talked about compute and virtualization. Zones are amazing, and not just zones, but there's KVM. And I can tell you that there's something else besides KVM on the horizon. It is similar to KVM, but even better. And no, it's not joint doing. And there'll be a little bit of a, what did I say earlier about competition being good? There's going to be a little bit of competition for KVM on Illumos, I think.
But this new virtualization technology will be published back to the code base?
Yes.
Okay.
The work is actually there's another hypervisor kind of technology, and it's being contributed to with support for, and it's open source, for Illumos as the core hypervisor. And it's not Zen.
Right.
But people are also using Zen now, right? So there's another one. So lots of things you can do with virtualization on Illumos. And a lot of the underlying technologies are also there for virtualization. So critically, Solaris zones, now there's Linux containers, and I haven't looked at Linux containers, so I'm a little cautious about wanting to compare the two. But
I was just going to ask you to do that.
But so I have been asked to do that just this weekend. It's like, oh crap, I need to go see where they are, because the last time I looked, they were pretty far.
Well, you also
pretty
need to
far off
look
the
at the Docker package as well. There's a whole.
Okay. Admittedly, my focus for the last 4 years has been Illumos.
Yep.
But you know, at one point I looked at FreeBSD gels as an example, and they were also pretty. There are some great ideas there which were used as inspiration when the team at Sun was building zones. But it was a little far off the mark. They were just it was missing things. My guess is that what's happening is that some of the differentiation in capabilities, that divide is narrowing, but there's still definite areas of I'll call core competency across the various kernels. Storage, I think I've talked at storage at length. Networking. Who in this room has heard of a project called Crossbow? Okay, actually, let me stop. Who in this room has not heard of ZFS? Okay, good. You all get to keep your geek card still. I can take it from anybody. But who's heard of Crossbow? Okay, cool. So Crossbow is a really cool networking virtualization technology. And there's a lot of material online. My goal here is not to enlighten you all about the details of Crossbow, but as a key technology, the founders of my employer, who are also Sun engineers, particularly Sune, but Robert was also at Sun as well. They decided, and Sune in particular, that this capability could really be enabling in the switching space. And we're going to see how that comes about in a couple of slides, where we're going to talk about kind of blurring of traditional boundaries. Last one here is a surprise, right? Solaris embedded? Really? Well, guess what? We're embedding it on a switch. The division between what is an embedded product and what is a traditional system is going away. My phone now has as much compute power probably as that Sun workstation I had that when I joined in
pizza box.
the Ultra Ones, right? It's probably, actually, I'm sure my phone actually probably smokes it.
Wow.
So that, while the operating system continues to demand additional, because Solaris and Illumos are focused in the server space primarily, so a lot of the approaches tend to favor higher memory configurations, larger disks, and so forth. It's still the case that we're seeing the blurring. I was recently involved with porting Solaris on an embedded platform. It is a switch, but it's not a traditional switch. It's more like, you could think of it as a backplane fabric inside a big blade server. And it's actually a little bit of a constrained environment. The constraint in this time is a hard disk that's 8 gig. It's an 8 gig SSD. Once upon a time, that would be huge. Now we think of this as an embedded system. So, runs great, beautifully. And we're doing some really cool stuff on that. And you'll hear more about that in the press releases from my company over the course of the next couple weeks. We're working with another big system manufacturer.
What makes it still embedded if it's 8 gigs? It's not like you have to squeeze everything into a kernel, libc, and busybox.
So what's the definition of embedded?
Just that it's inside hardware?
Well, everything's inside hardware at some level.
Right.
It's the form of delivery and the form of access. So if I download or I buy a disk and I go buy a computer and I install it and then I expect to run my applications on this thing that I might, and in the case of a Unix environment, if I expect that my customers are going to need access to a compiler, actually that's becoming somewhat less true. It's not true in the Mac, but traditionally we think of this as sort of the Unix space. A Unix computer, you need to deliver a compiler. Sun's old. We won't talk about that. But if I'm delivering an appliance, SmartOS is an embedded product at some level. It depends on the delivery. It's kind of a software appliance in that case. I tend, in my mind, to still think of it as an embedded environment as one that may be resource constrained. But critically, what's less important than resource constraints are what is the model of delivery? Do I have applications? Do I give my user a shell? I mean, a traditional shell. In this case, actually, it turns out there is a way to get to the shell, but that's not the product. The product is it's an appliance. Your Linux WRT firmware, right? It's an embedded environment, and actually you can load it up with DDWRT or whatever it's called, and yeah, you can get to a shell. But come on, it's an embedded environment. And the only thing that changes the way we think about this is there's not a lot of memory. There's not much storage. But I think that actually some of these routers that are coming out now with their embedded environments, I say routers, the consumer grade stuff, probably have are probably substantially more powerful, have more storage and more memory than the first computer I ran Linux on. Right? But so the thing is that yes, we're seeing embedded use of Illumos. There was embedded use of Solaris actually. Some of the big printers from a big printer manufacturer shipped with Solaris. Had a UI on front of it. Customer never interfaced with Solaris directly, but Solaris drove that software. We could call into question the sanity of using Unix for a printing subsystem, but anyway. So why Illumos in particular? Each one of these, I was trying to think about all the idiots, right? And so let's talk about, this is kind of taken down in order. So visibility. What's really cool about visibility? dtrace, of course, has to be the first and foremost. Yes, there's K-stats. If you're a kernel debugger, a kernel developer like I am, having a kernel debugger, I'll tell you. I was recently in a position to be asked to help solve a problem on Linux, and the way the problem was called out, it was a really gnarly problem associated with what happens when disks fail. And the belief was that this disk failure was causing other subsystems to start misbehaving about 45 minutes after the first failure was encountered. Okay? I haven't solved that problem for them yet. But I'll tell you what made this problem hard is every time I wanted to go look at a solution, it's like, well, here's where I jump in a debugger. Here's where I look at what dtrace. Can't do that. And because of the time it takes to reproduce the problem, in this case it took about 2 days to hit the problem. Figuring out what printfs you want to add, and retesting, and to try different hypotheses, it's really impractical. This is a really gnarly problem, and it's not my problem, but I was trying to help someone else with it, and I still don't know how they're going to solve it. Scalability. So this is one of Solaris's strengths, is its heritage. From the early days of Solaris 2, Solaris had support for symmetric multiprocessing. This was actually one of the early differences between SunOS 4 and Solaris. SunOS 4 started with a big kernel lock, and you could run maybe 2 processors, as long as they weren't loss processors, hypersparks, because they fell over when they ran concurrent. But anyway, the Solaris kernel was designed with fine-grained locking, and so it was inherently scalable. There's still a lot of work that goes on. I think I talked to some people at Oracle. They're still working on different pieces of this. But systems now are being built with enormous numbers of cores and enormous numbers of processors. So an Apple, you think of an Apple is sort of, you go buy a Mac Pro, and I was looking, and you can buy them with these hex core, hyper-threaded. There's 24 cores in a box this big. Right? And they're not slow cores, they're really fast. If you imagine trying to run a system with a big lock on it, and I remember not very long ago, I don't know what the situation with NetBSD is now. I remember not very long ago NetBSD had a big kernel lock. I think they fixed that. So because of the work done in that kernel, it allowed Sun even as early as the 90s to go up to run with nearly linear scalability on systems like the E10K that had 64 processors. And these were not, people were building Linux clusters even bigger than that, but the Linux clusters were not SMP. The E10K was an SMP processor. I did not have to change my application to take advantage of those cores. If my application was single-threaded, it was only going to use one, but if it could fork, or if it could just use normal threads, and in fact, some POSIX threads you could look at, because of the scalability work that was done inside Sun needed threading, created Solaris threads. Solaris threads strongly influenced POSIX threads. Flexibility. When you think about, in particular, the capabilities that people are starting to leverage with Solaris today, or Illumos today, and I point to SmartOS, I can point to Pluribus. So Pluribus, my employer, we produce a distribution internally. It's installed on the switch, makes use of zones, makes use of KVM, and this other thing that I haven't mentioned, I haven't revealed completely yet. It makes use of crossbow, and it uses some very high performance switch chips to produce a system that looks kind of like a computer with a lot of network ports and some hardware switching capabilities, but where the management of the decision making I can now go off and do in Solaris space, in a user space application, which is really, really powerful. The same kind of flexibility to embrace new ideas in Illumos in particular allows the creation of SmartOS. And I don't want to try to expose all of the things that SmartOS can do, but go look if you haven't, as I said.
Or I'll try and get some joint guys down here to tell us.
Security is important. It's important particularly in respect to the virtualization and multi-tenancy. Solaris, so I talk about Solaris. This is Illumos heritage, right? Solaris was one of the only multi-level secure certified systems. There was a really cool thing that Sunrays are gone now, but there's a really cool capability on Sunrays where you could actually have a multi-level trusted desktop and only have one network connection. And that was driven on top of Sunray software running on Solaris. So Illumos is the inheritor of this technology. Anyway, that's enough about security. Virtualization zones. Actually, I'll go back to security for a moment because it relates to the virtualization. So one of the cool things about virtualization, and if you run KVM on a Linux, KVM is great, right? You can run Linux on top of Linux or Windows on top of Linux, and everybody's happy, right? Except for what happens when there's a bug in KVM that lets you punch through the hypervisor. That's never happened before, has it? Yeah, it has. Well, if you're running on Linux, you're basically wide open. If you're running on an Illumos system where KVM runs inside a zone, you just escaped into a jail. Now what? Okay, that was fun. So it's a defense in depth that the virtualization of zones and KVM give you. For those of you who aren't aware, zones is OS virtualization, KVM is hardware virtualization. Hardware virtualization provides a nice narrow interface. It's well defined. You can run all your operating systems on it. OS virtualization allows us to actually have a somewhat wider interface, but a very performant one, and one that can be much more closely audited for correctness. It's much harder to write a robust hardware hypervisor than to just harden your OS. Stability. People still talk about their systems that have run a gazillion years in uptime, right? Illumos is rock solid. The last talk I was at with, actually this was before I started for Pluribus, Sune had come to talk about, or not come to talk, but he was revealing at that time that Pluribus was doing stuff on Illumos. And we have a product inside Pluribus that can run in user space on Linux or on Illumos. And the Linux code, it's not stable. And a lot of this is the result of what I'll call a very diverse development team. And a very forgiving platform in the sense that I can access a PCI device. It's just an address decode. The PCI device is memory. It's out there. It's directly addressable. And the way I see it, it's just I change some high order bits in the address. It's very, very easy to write a Linux device driver. barriers low. So there's a lot of Linux device drivers of varying quality. You can't get away with that in a historic platform like Solaris, particularly on Spark, where you've got rich IOMMU caches in the middle. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I prefer NetBSD when I'm looking at code to Linux's code. The NetBSD code tends to be more consistently of high quality. It's more consistently useful to me as I'm trying to understand what other people have found in the device. Anyone who's read Donald Becker's NIC drivers, and Donald Becker's a smart guy, he's produced a bajillion NICs, but try to make heads or tails of what those drivers are doing. So what else is happening? There's stealth downstreams. Actually, I guess I have more slides than I realized. So there's a bunch of companies, I've already mentioned them, they're making use of Illumos in places you don't know about. Some of them are starting to open up. Pluribus is one example. Others we know about. I happen to know, for example, Tgile produces a storage appliance using Illumos technology. I didn't get that information under NDA, so I can talk about it, but they don't. That's kind of unfortunate. I really wish that people would be more open with that and a bigger part of the community. So what I really hope for in the community is to embrace this. As people kind of do things more quietly, folks who don't have exposure to Illumos think that we're not widely used or deployed. There's not many people working on it. Turns out there's a lot more people working on this stuff than you realize. I believe that there are more people working on Illumos than are working on FreeBSD. We'll never compete with Linux. I have no desire to compete with Linux. To be honest, Android just breaks that, right? Frankly, I have no desire to see us spending resources on solving every possible problem like the Linux community does. They don't pick and choose problems. They shotgun all of them with actually surprisingly good results, but it takes an enormous amount of effort and risk for the whole community as well. So what's changed in the last? So I gave a talk a couple years ago. Some new things have been happening. Well, OmniOS came out. Actually, that's not all that recent, but it's a commercially supported distribution for servers that looks kind of like OmniOS. If you Open Indiana, if you used OpenSolaris, and you want something that you can get commercial support on, OmniOS looks kind of the same, and you don't have to pay through the nose, I don't think, like you would if you wanted to buy Solaris. Assuming you can still buy Solaris. I don't know. I haven't.
Yeah.
I know you can get it with hardware. I don't know if you can get it separate with hardware.
Yes, you can.
Can?
2 gram per core, or 2 gram per processor.
2 grand per processor?
Yeah.
Wow.
I can talk. I actually had a really interesting plane trip last night, coming back from the Bay Area, and I had some interesting information about what's going on inside Oracle. So there's a lot of actually, I'm just going to skip ahead to ZFS here for a minute. Now I'll come back to that. So hold that thought. So there's been a bunch of stuff in networking as well. So we all talked about crossbows. So Jordan's done a bunch of work around another project called Bardiche. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. B-A-R-D-I-C-H-E. There's been also work in the network stacks to support for performance, for enhancing security, IP filter, things like that. Most of the work is actually around virtualization and enhancing the support of in the networking stack for virtualization. You're going to also see, though, some work coming out of Pluribus because, of course, we are investing pretty heavily in the networking stack. There's been new players, Pluribus, OmniTI, and there's a few others that I know about that I think are on the verge of opening up. So that's good. And not just corporate players. There's been a large number of people, not large, there's been a steady flow of new people getting newly exposed to Illumos and exploring it. And in many cases actually doing some interesting things and enhancements. So we see that on the Illumos list. A lot of us are graybeards, but we need fresh blood. That's what keeps the community alive and healthy. Nexenta recently open sourced their kernel bits. They include some enhancements for NFS, for CIFS version 2. I think there's probably some ZFS work in there as well. Those are pretty big things. They included support for the VMware. I'm trying to remember the word for it. The offload support that VMware insists for iSCSI. So they've got some iSCSI protocol enhancements as well. There's been a bunch of work around performance. In fact, one of the changes I'm sitting on in my code base right now, and yes, I still code, is a change to the low-level DMA allocator. There's a critical scalability issue there that's going to eliminate that scalability issue. And that's this low-level DMA allocation. But a bunch of people are still working on this stuff across a variety of organizations. I've talked at length about virtualization. Of course, virtualization is sort of the hot topic of the last half decade or so. And I'd like to think that Illumos is a leader of this technology. Certainly zones, it's true with zones, I think it's true with Crossbow. It's to some extent true with the work that Joint did to get KVM running inside a zone on Illumos. And I think this next round of changes you're going to see coming out of Pluribus with this other virtualization technology is also going to be useful. A couple of years ago, not exactly, just about a couple of years ago, I started a firm, a company. It's gone now. That's another story. But we built an amazing storage product that made use of the combination of all of these technologies, ZFS, dtrace, and zones, to do some really amazing things. And I think that technology is still very viable, and you're going to see that arrive just from another location. Frankly, even if the technology we've created didn't see the light of day, someone else would reproduce it. It's just too useful and obvious. And what really enables it is the underlying capabilities of the platform. Other stuff, the ZFS Working Group has become OpenZFS. ZFS Working Group was a closed group of people that were kind of the recognized experts in the ZFS space. Originally, there was some belief that we needed to kind of protect the knowledge of. It was actually not the knowledge of what was being discussed, but of who was discussing it. So it's since been decided that that's no longer necessary, and it's an open mail list. And not only that, it is now an open. It's not a distribution, but it's a source repo. And there's a lot of cross collaboration between Linux, FreeBSD. I'm not sure. Illumos certainly, of course. In fact, I think there was a Mac port, and I think that's still alive, and there are active participants in that group. What's really interesting is the amount of change happening for Linux and FreeBSD. Admittedly, a lot of that change seems to be oriented around making ZFS work better on their platforms, rather than changes to the ZFS core. But there have been some good performance enhancements that have come out of those organizations as people, again, now are pushing the technology into some new areas.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you know why it is that Apple was publicly announcing they were going to implement ZFS and it was a big deal, and then they just quietly all that went away?
I don't have any non-public information about that. there's a lot of speculation that it was a breakdown in the licensing negotiations, for lack of a better term.
Anything that would give it a new hope now?
I have been told that by someone who was in a position to know, actually it was Don Brady, who actually worked at Apple, that Apple was creating a new file system group, and that they were going to try to go at their own and start over. I think that that's tilting at windmills, and we used to say that nobody starts new file system projects. It takes 10 years for a file system to mature. By the way, who knows how old is ButterFS these days? Has it reached 10 years yet? So ZFS is older than 10 years. ZFS has clearly reached that level of maturity. In fact, one measure of the level of maturity is on this plane ride. Apparently, there was a recent conversation amongst the inner circle at Oracle of Oracle engineers, and one of the conversations was, "Is anybody working on ZFS anymore?" And when I heard this, I said, my first response is, "Of course, just not at Oracle." So there's a lot of innovation happening around ZFS. And there's some interesting things people are doing. They're stretching. They're stretching what they can do with the metadata. They're stretching. So as an example, split mirroring, a mirror that crosses a metropolitan area network, right? And changing the priorities. I believe that work has been done at Nexenta, but I don't think they're the only ones who have done it. There's things people have done with changing the way caching, putting the cache on the the DDT or just metadata specific VDAVs. That work has happened I think in 2 or 3 different places I've heard about it. So people are doing cool stuff with ZFS. Some of which is coming back, some of which doesn't. People still like to keep their secret sauce. But ultimately it will all eventually come back, if only because everyone else will have done it, and at some point we'll just it loses its competitive value, and somebody will contribute it back, their version. And actually, for anyone who's in a position to make this decision, who's listening, there is value in having your implementation be the one that comes back with the common core. As someone who's had to deal with the merge headaches that happen when it's not yours, I encourage you to make the choice and be first. Okay. The good news, the other piece here is that Illumos is the reference upstream. It's not real, upstream is actually the wrong word, it's like side stream. But it's the reference implementation or reference deployment for ZFS. And the ZFS founders, if you will, inventors, Modulo, Jeff Bonwick, who's off doing something else with Bill Moore, which looks really interesting, but is not OS, doesn't touch the OS directly, as I understand it, is working on, so you think about Matt and George, and there's a bunch of other people as well, Eric, now Robert Mustacci, they're all working on Illumos at Joyent and Delphix. And they're working on ZFS. Actually, Matt and George, I think, will only work on ZFS. The other guys work on ZFS and a bunch of other stuff. Okay, so the next topic. So we've got a bunch of, I've talked about our kind of Jedi masters, our masters of the source. We need some Padawans. So what is Illumos doing to bring in fresh blood? Well, the good news is we've got Google Summer Code. We've done it the last couple of years. In fact, we might have done it in 11. I think we did. I was putting these slides together at the very last minute, so I apologize. And it looks like we're going to be in Google Summer Code for 14 as well. And what's happened is even though we haven't necessarily seen the amazing projects come out of Google Summer of Code, what we have seen happen is that we've gotten a couple of very consistent contributors. So people that contributed some code and keep contributing and keep enhancing. And that's more valuable than actually the code contribution. It's the repeat contributions that really make the ecosystem vibrant. So what about the future? I've really talked about blurring of boundaries. This is a trend across the industry. Systems like OpenStack are driving some of this. The commoditization of hardware. We talk in Pluribus about these things called white box switches. Has anybody else heard the term of a white box switch?
Yes.
What's a white box switch?
Yes.
It's an x86 processor and a switch chip from either Broadcom or Intel, and a bog standard PCI bus. And suddenly now these switch products, you put it in a chassis with a bunch of ports, 48 or whatever, 48, 10 gig ports or whatever, and it's a computer too. We're no longer seeing, it's no longer productive to build custom silicon to run the whole thing. No one can keep up with Intel, basically, right? Moore's Law has won. And so this is happening in the network space. It's also happening in the storage space, right? When NetApp first came out, all their stuff was silicon, right? Now they're running x86 motherboards. They put some fancy chassis on it, and the rest of the magic is in software. So that blurring of the boundaries means that a powerful OS that can service all of these needs starts to look really, really compelling. And Illumos is certainly not the only one here, but you're going to see more of it. Well, what this is going to do is it's going to enable, when we talk about those other capabilities, D-trace, zones, crossbow, it enables Illumos to actually be used in some of these very unique applications that were traditionally the domain of silicon. And that's really what we're seeing at Pluribus. And now we can start putting customer applications on the switch. I can run an OpenStack controller on the switch. I can run stuff in zones on top. I can run Linux in a KVM on my network switch, and I can have an API to have the two talk to each other, and that can drive switching decisions. I can provision VLANs from software.
You could run a neat little content distribution network node on your switch as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot of things you can do. And you can do the same thing with the storage, the old storage arrays, right? Well, I run an Exenta store or some of these other things. I can serve up NFS and CIFS and iSCSI. And I can still run my apps. And I don't need hardware anymore. I need hardware, but I don't need custom hardware. In fact, one of the things that ZFS, we like to say at ZFS is, you probably don't want hardware RAID. There's a lot of reasons you don't want hardware RAID. Where you're better off being served by the software, for the most part. I think you're going to see more surprise locations that you find Illumos. People are going to, it's creeping into products already. I haven't heard anybody porting it to a phone yet, and there's actually some questionable ideas about the sanity of that. But for control applications, why not? Actually, we have hard real-time priorities in Solaris and Illumos. We've had them forever.
What about other architectures?
That's a good question. So, Solaris, Illumos were designed to be portable. It has existed on 3 separate processor architectures in the past. And I'm counting the 3264-bit split as a single architecture. So we had PowerPC at one point, which was kind of short-lived, x86, and Spark. Today we still have Spark and x86. The Spark is kind of hobbling along, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. But yeah, I'd like to see it actually show up somewhere else.
Raspberry Pis.
There has been some work to make it work on ARM. There was a port of it for the System Z. Well, I'm not sure what the right term here is.
Yeah,
For the IBM Z series.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever.
Keeps changing.
The successor to the 360.
Yeah, I don't want to step on somebody else's trademark, but yeah, there was a port of that. It wasn't commercially viable for a variety of reasons. But ARM starts to look real interesting. ARM64, and there's some people starting to think seriously about ARMs and data centers. And in an open source community, why not? I was actually really keen to see Solaris. This was before Illumos existed. Ported to the MIPS 64 architecture, particularly back then there was the Octeon systems that had 64 core MIPS processors, and I thought that would have just been really, really awesome. I actually offered to do the port for them, but they decided they wanted to stick with Linux. I think they made a mistake. But you're going to see some surprise contributors, both individuals and commercial contributors. As I said, I know about some things happening. I think there's going to be a couple big names enter this space, and I think it's going to happen over the course of the next year or two. These capabilities are really compelling. There's another thing here, particularly around commercial contribution, and that is that I can build a product with Solaris, and I can keep part of it closed. That turns out to actually be really commercially powerful. While we would love to have everything be open, if you're spending $1 billion to build a product, you don't necessarily want to enable your competitors to bring the product to market before you do. And in fact, Oracle did this, right, with ZFS deduplication. Now, I actually happen to think that the release of deduplication source before Oracle released it in their formal product was actually very clever on Oracle's part, because it really allowed them to expand the test pool for deduplication. Much to the chagrin of more than one Nexenta customer. And a lot was learned about how to system engineer the software as well in the process. There's going to be more collaboration as well. In fact, I said back then, in 2010, I held my hand out to Oracle, and I said, we'd like you to be a part of this ecosystem. That really hasn't changed. What has changed is that the terms for that participation have. In 2010, I was willing to actually have a Sun contributor agreement and have Illumos contributors sign a Sun contributor agreement that would have given some exclusivity, some additional benefits, the ability to reclose the code back to Oracle. I'm no longer prepared to do that, and even if I was, most of the rest of the Illumos contributors would have me drawn and quartered if I tried. So, or certainly ejected from the community. So, the terms of that collaboration have changed. But, for Oracle, basically they have to play with the same rules the rest of us play by. But I think that you're also going to see additional collaboration between operating systems. There already exists a fairly healthy level of it. It happens around ZFS quite heavily right now. I think it's going to happen in other spaces. So I'm looking forward to more of that. I'm almost done. So somebody asked about architecture Spark. So these are kind of looming questions that people like to talk about on the mailing list. And I'm actually going to put myself out of favor with a few people. So Spark is an interesting question. I love Spark. It's where I grew up. Having a clean MIPS architecture is really beautiful. x86 is a mess. Get over it. x86 also won. It's VHS. Now, what's really interesting is the space is changing now, right? Because, you know, the most widely deployed Unix on the planet doesn't run on x86 processors. What's the most widely deployed Unix on the planet?
Android.
Android. Runs on your phone. So, x86, while Illumos remains x86 kind of bound, although we do have a Spark port, the health of that is somewhat questionable. And the health is questionable because there's no one who's actually demonstrated enough commercial merit for people who get paid to do the work, and people who want to do the work for free. Not enough of them with the right skills have come together to make it happen. It takes one or the other. So right now there's not. Well, I think there may be now one. I think something has happened where there is one distro that's kind of hobbled along and got Spark kind of working, but for a long time it was really questionable. And in my mind, it's still questionable. Spark is alive and well with Oracle, but what is alive and well in Oracle's distribution doesn't help us because A, we can't get access to that hardware, we can't get access to the specs nor the software code to run on it. So we'll wait until it gets cheap enough and free enough for NetBSD to do it, and then we'll take a look at it. I give it about 20, 30 years. So what about laptops and the desktop, right? Well, Illumos runs on laptops and desktop, and you can do that on OpenIndiana. A lot of people really focus on it. The big problem with this space is the really cheap commodity hardware and the driver support, right? Wi-Fi parts are a good case in point. Broadcom and Intel's actually a little bit better here about having parts that are supportable. Trying to support a Broadcom part on an open source operating system. Does it even work on Linux? Consistently? I don't think so, but I don't know. Conversely, what is the economic justification for this? I use a Unix desktop. I use a Unix laptop. As of about 3.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, it isn't Illumos, it's Mac. Why? Because I want to get stuff done. I can't compete with that. Illumos can't compete with that. And I don't think we should try to compete with it. I think that Illumos, I would rather see people who are working on contributing to Illumos, instead of working on how we can keep up or catch up, where can we go that no one else is going? The work done by Joanne around SmartOS was amazing, trend-setting work. That's really interesting. If somebody were able to come up with some really cool thing on the desktop, it's not that I have anything against desktops, but I don't, chasing that thing just seems silly. But if somebody could come up with a really cool idea, something really revolutionary, great.
What about EC2?
What about it?
How's the support for Illumos there?
Oh, there's Illumos AMIs there.
As far as I know, I remember that Nexenta actually paid somebody to do that work to do a port. I haven't looked at it.
There's, I think, an OmniOS AMI. It's listed on the Illumos wiki.
In general, that stuff it's just another virtualization environment. And in general,
it's an important one though for market share in the data center.
Yes, but in general, the virtualized hardware is easy to support. And the reason it's easy to support is it's fairly homogeneous.
Yeah.
Most of these environments support, frankly, kind of crappy old legacy chipsets, and the reason they do it is because that everybody has drivers for it, and it also means it's easy to support it. You know, and it's actually sad. E1000G. I remember when it was not an old legacy part, but it is an old legacy part now.
But I ask because it seems that if people that would be running Solaris, whether it's because they're running SAP or whatever, are not going to be going to Illumos, and people that would be running Linux to run web applications and all that are not going to be particularly inclined to go to Illumos,
Okay.
then the
Stop.
market seems to be embedded only these more.
So I'm actually going to
places.
I'm actually going to take objection with your second point.
I was hoping you would.
Because actually there is a substantial data point here about people who are running on Linux and running we'll use your web example, web-facing apps.
Mm-hmm.
So Joyent have made a business of attracting folks to run their Linux web tier applications. They bring them into their data center, they host them there, they host them on KVM. And then the next step is they move them to a native zone running Illumos and dtrace, so they get visibility into what their application is really doing and debugging it. And they're getting huge performance gains. There's a whole, go to the Joyent website, there's tons of white papers expressing it. They've had a lot of success moving customers from these kind of crappy little web apps that sit on a Linux box, but when they're hit under load, they get them to move to an Illumos native zone.
So its natural home might be in the data center as infrastructure.
I think that it's easy. The data center is an easy place for Illumos to live, and the reason it's an easy place for Illumos to live is it's not where its oldest roots are. Its oldest roots are workstations, but it's where it's most of the innovative things that are in it were done for the data center by Sun in the mid to late 90s during the .com era, right? So ever since that era, that has been its natural home. There are people doing other things with it for sure.
But people in their late to mid-20s that maybe didn't have an opportunity to work with Solaris maybe would be more attracted to Linux running on top of Linux.
That is a temptation, and it's a temptation that's made a little bit worse because everybody knows Linux is free and everybody can download it. So there's a mass knowledge about Linux, but there are some competing pressures. One is once they actually start to explore the underlying capabilities of the platform. And actually, some of the technologies that we have in Illumos are actually good at evangelizing Illumos. So ZFS is a good example. Bringing back in zones and dtrace into your problem solving, your tool chest. Once people explore these things, amazing things, they can start doing amazing things. There is this cognitive hurdle, and maybe it's not a cognitive hurdle, it's an exposure hurdle, to actually know what Illumos is. And that's why events like this are important. Unfortunately, as I look around the room, we all knew what Solaris was. So the challenge is how do we get the young guys who are coming out and all they saw is Linux and Java, right? And when they think of Sun, they think of Java, right? Java was cool technology, but actually, Illumos and Solaris are cooler. So how do we get them?
Also, the question will be, sorry to interrupt, how to make it appealing when Linux starts catching up by getting LXC where it should be and ZFS on Linux, and then maybe even getting dtrace integrated someday.
When all those happen, and assuming that at the same time Illumos has not kept the pace of innovation up, well, you know what? Then I'll have no point. I'll have no objection.
Those aren't the only selling points, though, for the Solaris kernel ideologies over Linux.
It isn't, right? So actually, and you're right, I actually will have objection because I do have to write kernel code.
Yeah.
And I have to support it. And I know that on enterprise hardware, this stuff just works. And robust, and it's a lot easier to support. It's a lot easier to support as an IT guy. It's a lot easier to support as a developer. One of the things I had back in my list was I meant to talk about stability. Okay. How often do you download a new driver for Linux and it just works out of the box without having to involve a compiler? Has anybody had a success with that?
I haven't had to download a driver for Linux since the late 90s.
You haven't had to download one. Okay. That actually says a lot there too.
It's better.
Well, if you have a desktop running Linux, you have to download the NVIDIA drivers almost every 6 months.
Every time you turn around with that, yeah. But okay, so that says no. But the exposure you're telling me is one of two things. It identifies 2 points. One point is that the set of developers working on Linux is spread very wide, and that's true. The other is that there's less churn in hardware. That's partly true, but it's not completely. I'll tell you that I recently encountered an Intel NIC, and you're right, I didn't have to download a new driver for it. I had to download a new version of Linux. It was a new NIC. Yes, somebody had done the work to upstream the driver, which is great.
Are you talking about Linux the kernel or Linux the operating system you had to install?
Well, in my case, it was actually a new distro, a new version of CentOS, because there was little kernel pieces that needed to be there to support that piece of hardware, and unfortunately, it was more than just the vendor device ID. There's knowledge hard-coded in the IGB driver that was necessary to update. For my case, because I wasn't really doing any work on Solaris, Illumos, it was no big deal. But if that had been an add-in NIC, that could have been tragically bad. And to add a new driver to that doesn't happen except via update of the entire distro. And the reason for that...
You could just upgrade the kernel.
Let's talk about that. Okay. So when you upgrade the kernel, a driver, I can upgrade it with source and compile. And you're right, I could download I could pull down that, recompile, and that's one possible thing. And that's actually what really happens is in the Solaris space, you kind of have to supply source and hope and pray, if you're a kernel guy, that they haven't changed a structure, changed the name of a structure or an offset. You can't. Well, an offset would prevent a binary, so that's why you have to do source. There's no stable. We call it stable DDI.
Is it possible that Illumos is going to suffer respect in the embedded world because Solaris, which had really a superior microkernel architecture to Linux, never got the word out that it was such a great architecture?
Well, the issue is not that it suffers, is that we're going to lose respect. It's actually trying to get acknowledgement that we're even a candidate there. Because people don't think of, because of the resource requirements that people associate with Solaris, they don't think of it as an embedded OS. And there's nothing wrong with that. And actually, if you think about the way most people deploy Illumos-based distributions, you really do want to have more memory because you're going to run ZFS, particularly if you're going to use ZFS. If you're not using ZFS, but then you wind up in one of these edge cases and you wind up having to do a lot of other work. But at the same time, the definition of an embedded system is changing. 4 gigs is it's kind of par for the course in the embedded environment these days.
Can you ask a question? Do you give out or do you communicate with do you have like a set of standards that you communicate to the manufacturers or the contributor? Like a set of standards that if you stick with this, you know, like let's say you talk to Dell, right? If you stick with this mainstream, this OS gonna work with your system.
So that's actually good. That's actually a really good question. Illumos does not. Some of the vendors maintain hardware compatibility lists. Some of the downstreams do. So Nexenta has their hardware compatibility list. I believe Joyent has one. In general, if you're using enterprise grade hardware, there's probably drivers for it. It probably works.
Well, I'm speaking from like a user point of view.
Yeah.
Because I use Linux, right? If you go back a couple of years ago, a few years ago, you know, I have like a mainstream Canon inkjet printer. It don't work. You know, I mean, like,
yeah. That's always going to be a problem.
You know, I mean, like, at least if you communicate with them, like, okay, get the mainstream working. You know.
This problem, what you call mainstream. Mainstream is where, which space. This problem is why I look in particular at these two. This space is dominated by churn. You know, there's constant new parts, new Wi-Fi, new NIC, new power controllers. It's the amount of churn in the consumer space is almost impossible to keep up with. Linux struggles with it, and
it works on Windows. That's good.
Yeah, well, the reason it works on Windows is all those companies hired their own developers to maintain those drivers for Windows. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why Windows is such a piece of crap. Because most of those hardware companies don't know how to hire software engineers. And you look at, you know, this is actually one of the worst things about Windows, right? You get a new piece of hardware, and you install the drivers. You know, I was installing a new NVIDIA driver the other day, and it was, I don't remember how many megabytes, like hundreds of megabytes. It's a video driver. I understand that it's going to be bigger than a NIC driver, but hundreds of megabytes? Are you kidding me?
Probably got your
No, I don't need a new bar on my search bar on my browser. I don't need a weather app. I just want to make my hardware work.
Garrett, but you yourself use macOS. You admit you use macOS as your development environment. At this point, I mean, I remember in 1993, I could not buy a video card that I could get to work with anything. Any drivers at all for Linux were reverse engineered, and so they couldn't take advantage of any of the best features of the hardware.
That's right.
And it was probably 10 years before I could go to Fry's Electronics and easily find video cards that said Linux on the box were supported. So if it's 10 years and that's with pretty good momentum, then should we just be giving up on thinking of Illumos as a desktop?
That's actually my point. Yes, that's my point. Why do I want to spend time on that? I can't. Okay. So what are the pressures in that space, particularly in the desktop and mobile space? Okay. Linux has demonstrated that it can be done, but it's a huge struggle. Okay. I did it for a while. I could only buy ThinkPads from IBM. Why? Because that was the only thing that had the high-end hardware on it that Illumos supported, right? Otherwise, I went up with some bizarre Marvell part on this, and you know, this, that, and the other, and you know, half of the devices on the. It was like to go buy an Illumos supported laptop. I remember going around. I was in St. Petersburg. I was buying laptops for my engineers, and we were going through stores trying different laptops, and they would have like one or two of this one. And we'd have to go to another store and try some more. It was a multi-day effort to buy like 6 laptops that could support Linux, Illumos. No, this is crazy. Mac works because they engineer the operating system and the hardware together, and it just works.
Same with Sun, right?
Same with Sun. Yeah.
Slightly different perspective. Joyent makes the point that it's just more efficient to run Solaris or Illumos or SmartOS. You get more for your money with the same hardware.
That's right.
Has there been any response or penetration into the other gigantic cloud companies like Amazon or Google? Do you get anything back from them at all, or are they just stuck with their flavors of Linux?
Nothing that can be said publicly.
Okay.
Behind you, though, there was a hand raised.
The idea of getting into the embedded space with more appliance level ARM processors, the problem that I see with what you're saying is that a lot of that it doesn't use enterprise level equipment. You end up using Broadcom, you end up using Marvell.
Actually, there's nothing wrong with Broadcom, specifically in the enterprise, unless you're talking about their Wi-Fi.
But as it were, is there any, and I'm coming to this completely black box, I don't understand that level. Is there anything you can do shim-wise with the drivers and look at like NetBSD, which has very good support for pretty much everything? I mean, it's in its mission statement more or less. Of course, it runs NetBSD.
Okay, so let's talk about it. It's a good question. So if you think about enterprise-grade hardware, what are the hardware devices you need on a server? You need networking. Okay, so with ARM, you're going to find one of two things. You're going to find that either it's an add-in NIC on the server, in which case it's just a NIC. So you support, if you support an Intel NIC, okay, well, we have the source, we just recompile. Right? If it's on chip, on die, if that space becomes popular, then those dies will probably become, or that part of the chip, that device will become a part of that port. And yeah, somebody will do the work. It's not hard to write a NIC driver. I've done it enough times that I know whereof I speak. It's just there has to be enough motivation to do the work. And in the case of an embedded environment like that, it's more likely that the specs, that's the hard part. Figuring out how the device works. Writing the driver, that's the easy part. Reverse engineering is terrible. That's why Broadcom Wi-Fi never works, because you have to reverse engineer it. And it's why there's been so much trouble with the Novu drivers on video and Linux for so long. They were reverse engineering things. So that, I'm not worried about that. What are the other devices? Okay, so HBAs. HBAs are a little bit of a challenge, but not also. I see really only a couple standards there. AHCI, well, that's open, right? We have a source for that. Drivers from another vendor. I don't imagine that ARM is going to invent a new SAS chip just to support ARM. No, they're going to take an off-the-shelf part, probably an LSI or Daptic part, stick it on the bus, and as long as we have source, done. Bob's your uncle. So even though there's some churn in the chip, in the CPU, you don't see, as long as you're using enterprise-grade peripherals, you don't see the churn. If that makes sense.
But don't they still keep, for example, I seem to recall Broadcom being an example of this. They will release some, but keep a relatively decent amount of their intellectual property in terms of the drivers, how to interface with their chips behind the closed door.
It's definitely true with their Wi-Fi parts. It's not true of their normal NICs. That said, I need to be careful because their 10G NICs are maybe a different story. I don't remember whether that source is all in the open in Illumos or not. If it's not, it should be, and it will be.
That lack of sufficient information to actually do your driver is not always intentional. A lot of times it's a new part.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do it themselves really, but they work on it internally to get it to run on something that's going to sell zillions of copies, and then say, okay, we know it works. And then if you try to read their specifications, like you try to read.
Well, I happen to know in the case of the Broadcom Wi-Fi. There are, at least there were, this was years ago now, but when I was trying to get, and this is for another proprietary project, I wanted to build a Solaris driver for Spark laptops, for their parts. And what I was told was it was not possible because there was no documentation and their source was not supportable for anybody else, and so they were just the only. And at that time, Broadcom insisted that they own the drivers, and even though Broadcom parts were in Apple, Broadcom produced the driver and maintained it for Apple. I don't know whether that's still true, but that was the case. I guess now it's about a decade ago, but I imagine it probably is. I don't imagine that they have done that much to change that part of their organization. But it was not, as you said, it was not some intentional thing where they were like, no, we don't want to share. It was like, no, we don't want to spend the resources that we would have to share. Now the other thing is that there's some other trends. So they're also oriented around kind of open specs that will help. So NVMe, who's heard of NVMe? Nobody's heard of NVMe? Okay, I guess I'm a storage geek. So NVMe is a standard for taking a bunch of flash memory, sticking it on a PCI card, or putting it on a PCI bus directly, and accessing it as a block device. Today, there's a few different products that do this. Fusion I/O. I imagine a lot of people in this room have heard of Fusion I/O. Yeah. Fusion I/O, unfortunately, is not, as far as I can see externally, does not look to be a big fan of NVMe because it lowers their barrier for competition. But NVMe is backed by Intel. This is a PCI class standard, which means that like AHCI, it will be possible for anyone to get a spec and write a driver for it. And you'll be able to buy one of these cards from vendor X, vendor Y. And I know that there's actually quite a few vendors working on NVMe capable cards today. So the churn at the level that driver people care about will be gone for that, because it modulo errata, which unfortunately means that well, fortunately for many driver people, that means that they'll still be employed. But the pain and suffering for a lot of that will go away. Okay. So mobile is another one of these spaces. So that's the other thing, is the desktop has kind of become irrelevant, right? Unless you're a developer, you know, it hasn't reached irrelevance yet, but people are using iPads and Google tablets, and you know, the space has changed. I'm not giving away my laptop or my desktop. So I'm done. We can. I don't know how long we have the room for it, but I'm open for Q&A.
Well, we were gonna head over to Islands across the street, get some food. I don't know if you have time to do that, but I'm sure Carolyn.
I'm parched.
Yeah, Q is hosted. I think they've had meetups all week, so I'm sure Carolyn's about done.
Well, it's the only one I've been to all week. So.
Oh, okay, good. So she's
yeah,
right. So let's bullshit for a while. But
it.
everybody's welcome to join in a few minutes or so. We'll go across the street to Islands, get some food and drink.
Okay.
Before you break up, the UCLA Linux user group is having an install fest Saturday.
Wow, an install fest, awesome. And hey, thanks everybody for coming down. I really do appreciate it. Next month I'm working on Charles Weibel will be doing a presentation. He's got a mesh network implementation. He'll be doing that via Google Hangout or something like that because he's based in Austin. And his mesh network is deployed.
You knew I couldn't use a Google Hangout?
But I didn't know if it was I didn't know if it was going to work. And
I came up from San Diego.
Yeah. No, it's much better than having a room. And in his case, it was impossible.
Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I thought I was going to be short. I'm sorry.
No, I know, I knew. No, this is great. This is awesome. Where else do you get this? Nowhere.